October 17, 1940, Iceland. Gunnar Randers stood alone in a weather observation station so remote that supply ships visited once monthly. He was 28 years old, a meteorologist employed by the Icelandic Meteorological Office to record atmospheric conditions in the North Atlantic. His job was data collection, temperature, pressure, wind speed, observations transmitted daily to Reykjavik for inclusion in regional forecasts. Routine scientific work that had seemed strategically irrelevant until Britain went to war, and suddenly, North Atlantic weather determined whether convoys reached England or sank in storms. Randers had been recording unusual atmospheric conditions for 3 days, barometric pressure dropping rapidly, wind patterns shifting from expected seasonal norms, temperature gradients indicating unstable air masses converging. Each observation individually wasn't alarming. Collectively, they suggested a major storm system was developing. Not a typical North Atlantic autumn storm, something larger, more violent, a system that could generate waves exceeding 20 meters and winds over 100 kilometers per hour. He calculated the storm's probable track. Southwest from his position, directly across the convoy routes between Canada and Britain, timing suggested maximum intensity would coincide with convoy Hake 79's transit through the most exposed section of the North Atlantic. The convoy had departed Halifax 5 days earlier, 79 merchant ships carrying food, fuel, ammunition, and supplies that Britain needed desperately, protected by 12 escort vessels, scheduled to reach the danger zone where Randers predicted the storm would hit on October 19th. He transmitted his forecast to Reykjavik on October 17th at 1400 hours, used standard meteorological coding to describe atmospheric conditions and predicted developments, emphasized that a severe storm was forming, that maximum intensity would occur in the central North Atlantic, that shipping should be warned. His transmission was acknowledged. Reykjavik confirmed receipt. Randers assumed his forecast would be integrated into British Admiralty weather planning, that convoy Hake 79 would receive storm warnings, that ships would prepare for severe conditions. His assumption was wrong. Reykjavik forwarded his forecast to British Meteorological Office in London. London reviewed it alongside forecasts from other stations. Multiple weather services were providing North Atlantic predictions. Most showed normal autumn conditions. Some indicated moderate storms. Randers's forecast was the only one predicting a severe storm system. His data came from a single remote station. His analysis contradicted consensus forecasts from more established meteorological services. British Meteorological Office classified his forecast as outlier data, possibly accurate but probably exaggerated, not reliable enough to justify major operational changes. The Admiralty received multiple weather forecasts. The consensus indicated rough but manageable conditions, nothing suggesting convoy Hake 79 needed to alter course or prepare for extreme weather. Convoy commanders were informed that North Atlantic conditions would be challenging, but within normal parameters for autumn transit. No special precautions required, no course adjustments needed. Proceed according to standard operational procedures. Randers didn't know his forecast had been dismissed. He continued monitoring atmospheric conditions on October 18th. The pressure continued dropping. Wind speeds were increasing. Every observation confirmed his prediction. The storm was developing exactly as he had calculated. He transmitted updated forecasts, made his warnings more explicit, stated that ships in the central North Atlantic would face life-threatening conditions starting October 19th, that waves would exceed safe operational limits for merchant vessels, that convoy operations should be suspended until the storm passed. These updated warnings were also forwarded to London. Also classified as outlier data, the consensus forecast remained unchanged. Moderate conditions, manageable seas. Convoy Hake 79 continued southwest across the Atlantic, approaching the area where Randers's storm was developing. 79 merchant ships, thousands of sailors, cargo worth millions of pounds, all proceeding into conditions that one isolated meteorologist in Iceland was predicting would be catastrophic, while every established weather service was saying would be routine. On October 19th at 0300 hours, convoy HX 79 entered the storm. Winds exceeded 120 kilometers per hour. Waves reached 25 meters. The convoy formation disintegrated immediately. Ships couldn't maintain position in the chaos. Visibility dropped to near zero. Radio communication became impossible through the interference. Merchant vessels were scattered across hundreds of square kilometers of violent ocean, each ship fighting individually to survive. No coordination, no mutual support, just desperate attempts to keep bows pointed into waves that threatened to roll ships completely over. The storm lasted 14 hours. When conditions improved enough for ships to regroup, convoy Hake 79 had been devastated. 12 merchant ships sunk, not from U-boat attacks, from the storm itself, ships foundering in massive seas, cargo breaking loose and causing catastrophic stability loss, structural failures from wave impacts, over 300 sailors dead, drowned when their ships went down in conditions so violent that rescue was impossible. Even when other vessels were nearby, the survivors who reached Britain reported that the storm had been unlike anything they had experienced, that weather forecasts had not prepared them, that if they had known the severity, they would have prepared differently, would have secured cargo more carefully, would have adjusted loading to improve stability, would have positioned ships to ride out the storm rather than attempting to maintain formation. The lack of warning had cost lives. British Admiralty investigated, wanted to understand why weather forecasts had been so wrong, why convoy Hake 79 had been allowed to proceed into conditions that destroyed 12 ships. The investigation found that warnings had existed, that an Icelandic meteorologist at a remote station had predicted the storm accurately, that his forecast had been transmitted but dismissed as outlier data that contradicted consensus analysis. Gunnar Randers had been right. Every other meteorological service had been wrong, and over 300 sailors had died because institutional weather forecasting trusted consensus over a single analyst whose data and calculations were accurate. Randers learned about the convoy disaster on October 22nd when supply vessel arrived at his station. The captain told him that convoy Hake 79 had been devastated by a massive storm, that 12 ships had been lost, that survivors were reporting conditions far worse than forecast. Randers immediately understood what had happened. His warnings had been ignored. The storm he had predicted had occurred exactly as he calculated. Ships had sailed into it without adequate warning, because meteorological consensus had overridden his analysis. He was devastated. He had done his job correctly, had identified the developing storm system, had calculated its track and intensity, had transmitted warnings with increasing urgency, had provided all the information necessary to prevent the disaster, but institutional processes had filtered his warnings, had classified them as unreliable because they contradicted consensus, had allowed ships to proceed into catastrophic conditions. Because one meteorologist's accurate forecast couldn't overcome multiple services' incorrect forecasts, Randers wrote a detailed report, documented his observations from October 15th through 19th, showed how each data point had indicated storm development, explained the atmospheric physics that had allowed him to predict intensity when other services hadn't, demonstrated that his methodology had been sound, that his forecast had been accurate, that the disaster had been preventable if his warnings had been acted upon. He sent this report to Reykjavik, to British Meteorological Office, to anyone who might investigate why the forecasts had been wrong. He wasn't trying to prove he had been right. He was trying to ensure the institutional failure wouldn't repeat, that future warnings from remote stations wouldn't be dismissed simply because they contradicted consensus, that accurate minority forecasts would be given appropriate weight in decision-making. The response was defensive. British Meteorological Office acknowledged that Randers's forecast had been more accurate than consensus predictions, but they defended the decision to rely on consensus, explained that weather forecasting was inherently uncertain, that single-station data was less reliable than multi-station analysis, that Randers's accuracy had been fortunate, but not necessarily indicative of superior methodology, that the institutional process of weighting multiple forecasts remained sound, even though it had failed in this instance. This response infuriated Randers. The institutional process hadn't just failed, it had killed 300 people. His forecast hadn't been fortunate, it had been based on rigorous analysis of atmospheric conditions that other services had either not observed or not interpreted correctly. The dismissal of his work as lucky rather than skilled was insulting. More importantly, it suggested the institution hadn't learned that future accurate warnings from remote observers would be handled the same way, dismissed as outliers, filtered through consensus processes that prioritized institutional comfort over individual analytical accuracy. He considered resigning, walking away from meteorological work entirely. But he realized that would accomplish nothing. The problem wasn't that weather forecasting was impossible. The problem was that institutional forecasting couldn't accommodate accurate dissenting analysis, couldn't integrate warnings that challenged consensus. His resignation wouldn't fix that. Only continued operation and continued accurate forecasting might eventually force institutional change. So he stayed at his remote station, continued recording observations, continued transmitting forecasts, but he also began documenting institutional responses, recording when his forecasts agreed with consensus and when they disagreed, tracking how often his minority forecasts proved more accurate than consensus predictions, building evidence that remote station analysis provided valuable information, that consensus methods were systematically underweighting. Through late 1940 and into 1941, this pattern repeated. Randers would identify weather systems developing, would forecast conditions that differed from consensus, would be proven right, while consensus forecasts proved wrong. Each instance was documented. Each became part of his growing case that institutional meteorological processes needed reform, but documentation alone wouldn't force change. Randers needed allies, needed other meteorologists who recognized the problem, needed institutional voices arguing that accurate minority forecasts deserved more weight. He started corresponding with other remote station observers, found that many had similar experiences, had provided accurate forecasts that were dismissed, had watched their warnings ignored while consensus predictions that proved wrong were accepted. This informal network began sharing information, comparing experiences, developing alternative forecasting methodologies that weighted remote station data more heavily. They couldn't change official forecasting procedures, but they could demonstrate that their methods produced more accurate results, could build evidence that would eventually force institutional recognition. The opportunity came in March 1941. Randers detected another major storm developing. His analysis indicated it would be even more severe than the October system, would impact convoy routes at a time when multiple convoys were transiting the North Atlantic. He transmitted his forecast through official channels. As expected, it contradicted consensus predictions. Consensus showed moderate conditions. Randers' forecast showed catastrophic storm, but this time, Randers didn't just submit through official channels, he also contacted the informal network of remote observers, asked them to review their data, to independently assess whether his storm prediction was accurate. Multiple observers confirmed his analysis. They were seeing the same atmospheric signatures, were calculating similar storm tracks and intensities. The consensus forecast was wrong. The remote observers agreed on this. Randers compiled these independent confirmations, sent them to British Meteorological Office along with his official forecast, argued that multiple independent analyses from different remote stations all agreed that this wasn't outlier data from a single source, that institutional consensus was contradicted by coordinated observations from multiple observers who were all seeing conditions that consensus was missing. British Meteorological Office faced a decision: maintain consensus forecast despite multiple contradicting reports from remote observers, or weight the remote station analysis more heavily and issue severe storm warnings. The stakes were higher this time. Multiple convoys were at risk. If the remote observers were right and consensus was wrong, the casualties would dwarf the HX-79 disaster. After internal debate, British Meteorological Office issued modified forecasts, not full adoption of Randers' severe storm prediction, but upgraded warnings acknowledging that conditions might be worse than consensus, indicated that ships should prepare for possible severe weather, that convoy commanders should have contingency plans for storm conditions. The modified warnings reached convoy commanders on March 26th. The convoys were already at sea, but had time to implement precautions, secure cargo more carefully, adjust loading, prepare for heavy weather. The ships that received these warnings treated them seriously, made preparations that proved critical. When the storm hit on March 28th, the storm was as severe as Randers predicted. Winds exceeded 130 kilometers per hour. Waves reached 30 meters, but convoy casualties were minimal. 3 ships damaged, none sunk, no casualties. The convoys survived because they had been warned, because preparations had been made, because Randers' forecast had been partially acted upon despite contradicting consensus. The contrast with HX-79 was stark. Similar storm severity, similar convoy sizes, completely different outcomes. The October disaster had killed 300 sailors because warnings were ignored. The March convoys survived with no casualties because warnings were partially heeded. The difference was institutional response to minority forecasts that contradicted consensus. British Admiralty investigation after the March storm reached different conclusions than the October investigation. This time, the recommendation was that remote station forecasts should receive greater weight, that accurate minority predictions deserved serious consideration, even when contradicting consensus, that the institutional bias toward consensus had been responsible for preventable casualties, that procedures needed reform. The procedural reforms implemented after March 1941 changed how British Meteorological Office processed weather forecasts. Remote station observations were given dedicated analysis. Minority forecasts weren't automatically dismissed as outliers. When remote observers provided coordinated warnings that contradicted consensus, those warnings triggered elevated review processes. The institutional bias toward consensus was reduced though not eliminated. Accurate dissenting forecasts had pathways to influence operational decisions. Randers had forced this. Change through persistent, accurate forecasting and careful documentation. But the change came at personal cost. He had spent 18 months at an isolated weather station fighting institutional skepticism, had watched 300 sailors die because his warnings were dismissed, had built a network of remote observers and coordinated independent analysis, had finally achieved institutional recognition that remote station data deserved respect. The victory was real, but had been purchased with exhaustion and frustration. He continued working at the remote station through 1942. His forecasts were now taken seriously. When he warned of severe conditions, convoy routes were adjusted. When he predicted storm tracks, ships were warned adequately. His accuracy rate remained high. His contribution to convoy safety was measurable. Between April 1941 and December 1942, his storm warnings were credited with preventing an estimated 12 ship losses and saving approximately 800 lives. But the isolation was destroying him psychologically. Remote weather stations were designed for rotation. Observers typically served 3 to 6 months before being replaced. Randers had been at his station for over 2 years. Supply visits were his only human contact. The work was critical, but the conditions were brutal. Arctic weather, complete isolation, constant pressure knowing that his forecasts directly influenced whether sailors lived or died. The psychological strain was unsustainable. He requested transfer in January 1943, asked to be rotated to a less isolated posting, acknowledged that his continued effectiveness at the remote station was declining due to psychological exhaustion. The request was denied. British Meteorological Office responded that his forecasting accuracy at that specific location was too valuable, that replacing him risked degrading forecast quality, that his transfer would be considered after the war, when operational requirements were less critical. This decision was devastating. Randers understood the logic. His forecasts were saving lives. Replacing him with someone less experienced might reduce accuracy, but the institution was prioritizing operational effectiveness over his well-being, was treating him as essential infrastructure rather than a person who needed relief. The message was clear. His mental health mattered less than his continued service at the remote station. He continued working, had no choice. Wartime service wasn't voluntary. His position was critical to convoy safety. Walking away meant abandoning sailors who depended on his forecasts, but his psychological state deteriorated. The isolation became unbearable. The pressure of knowing that forecast errors meant deaths became crushing. By mid-1943, he was experiencing symptoms of severe depression and anxiety. His forecasting accuracy declined, not dramatically, but measurably. He missed subtle atmospheric indicators, made calculation errors. His warnings became less precise. British Meteorological Office noticed, reviewed his recent forecasts, found declining. Performance concluded that his psychological state was affecting his work. In September 1943, they finally approved his transfer, not because they cared about his well-being, because his declining accuracy made him less valuable than a fresh observer might be. Randers was transferred to Reykjavik, assigned to administrative duties, no longer conducting primary observations, no longer making critical forecasts. The work was safer, less isolated, but also less meaningful. He had spent 3 years doing work that directly saved lives, had been recognized as one of the most accurate meteorologists in the North Atlantic. Now he was processing paperwork and coordinating supply logistics for weather stations. The transition from critical to irrelevant was psychologically difficult. He remained in that administrative role through the end of the war, tried to rebuild his mental health, partially succeeded. The depression never fully resolved. The isolation had left permanent psychological scars. When the war ended in May 1945, Randers was 33 years old, burned out, exhausted, damaged by 3 years of isolated service that the institution had prolonged beyond sustainable limits. He resigned from meteorological work in 1946, returned to civilian life in Reykjavik, found employment in commercial, shipping, administrative work, nothing related to weather forecasting. He couldn't return to meteorology. The field reminded him of isolation, pressure, and the 300 sailors who died because his October 1940 warnings were dismissed. He needed distance from work that had consumed and damaged him. British Meteorological Office documented his contributions after the war. Internal reports credited his forecasts with preventing significant convoy losses, calculated that his storm warnings had saved approximately 15 ships and over 1,000 lives between October 1940 and September 1943, acknowledged that his accurate forecasting despite institutional skepticism had forced reforms that improved all North Atlantic weather services, but these acknowledgments remained classified. Operational details about convoy routing and weather intelligence weren't released publicly. Randers received no public recognition, no awards, no acknowledgement that his work had been strategically important. He was a civilian meteorologist who had served in a remote station during the war. His contribution was noted in classified files, but not in public records. The sailors who survived because of his warnings didn't know he existed. The institution that had used him until he broke had documented his value, but hadn't recognized it. Publicly, he died in 1968 at age 56. Heart attack. His obituary mentioned he had worked in meteorological services during the war, mentioned his later career in shipping, nothing about accurate storm forecasts that saved convoys, nothing about forcing institutional reforms, nothing about the psychological cost of 3 years in isolation doing work that directly determined whether sailors lived or died. Those details remained in classified British archives. Declassification began in 1974. Researchers studying North Atlantic convoy operations found references to Source Iceland in weather intelligence reports. Cross-referencing identified Gunnar Randers. His forecasts were documented in detail. His accuracy was quantified. His institutional struggles were evident in correspondence between British Meteorological Office and Reykjavik. The complete picture emerged. One isolated meteorologist had been more accurate than entire institutional forecasting networks, had forced reforms through persistent correctness, had saved over 1,000 lives, had been psychologically destroyed by the work, and died at 56 without recognition. Academic papers published in the 1980s analyzed his contribution. Meteorologists studied his methodology, understood why his forecasts had been more accurate than consensus. He had been positioned to observe atmospheric conditions that other stations missed, had understood North Atlantic weather patterns through direct experience, had developed analytical techniques that institutional forecasting hadn't incorporated. His accuracy hadn't been luck, it had been superior methodology, applied by someone in the right location with the right expertise. Military historians calculated operational impact. Convoy Hake 79's disaster had killed 300 and influenced subsequent operations. If Randers' warnings had been heeded, those deaths would have been prevented. His March 1941 warnings had prevented similar disasters. His subsequent forecasts through September 1943 had prevented an estimated 15 ship losses. Conservative calculations suggested he had saved 1,200 to 1,500 lives through accurate forecasting that often contradicted institutional consensus. But recognition came 16 years after his death. Too late for him to know that historians had documented his contributions. Too late for institutional acknowledgement. Too late for anything except historical footnotes in specialized academic publications about North Atlantic convoy operations. The Weather Observer, whose storm forecasts saved the North Atlantic Fleet, proved that accurate individual analysis could be more valuable than institutional consensus, that remote observers with direct experience sometimes understood conditions better than central planning offices with more resources, that institutional biases toward consensus could kill people when they filtered accurate warnings. Gunnar Randers saw the storm coming, calculated its track and intensity, warned everyone who would listen, and watched 300 sailors die because institutions trusted consensus over his accurate minority forecast. Then he forced institutional reform by continuing to be right when consensus was wrong, saved over 1,000 lives through forecasts that challenged comfortable institutional assumptions, and paid for this success with 3 years of psychological isolation that broke his health and ended his career. He died at 56, never knowing that military historians would eventually calculate that he had been one of the most effective intelligence assets in the Battle of the Atlantic, not through code-breaking or espionage, through weather forecasting from a remote station where institutional meteorology had exiled him and then refused to rotate him out because his accuracy was too valuable to risk. The institution used him until he broke, then documented his value in classified files, then forgot him. And 16 years after he died, researchers discovered that the meteorologist nobody remembered had saved more convoy sailors than any other individual weather observer in the war.